Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. I am Awasar, Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the MSU African Studies Center. This is Eye on Africa, our weekly seminar series. I'm very delighted today to welcome Dr. Seyram Avle, who is Assistant Professor of Global Digital Media in the Department of Communication at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Her research focuses on digital technology cultures and innovation across part of Africa, China, and the United States. This work primarily takes a critical approach towards understanding how digital technologies are made and used, as well as their implications for issues of labor, identity, and futures. Dr. Avle's research is interdisciplinary and has been published in venues across communication studies, human-computer interaction, and science and technology studies. Her work has received funding from the National Science Foundation and ProQuest, among others. We are very delightful to have you, Dr. Avle. Welcome and thank you for coming. I pass it on to you.
Thank you for having me. I am going to now share my screen. If you can confirm that you can see it, that would be great. Yes? Okay.
Not yet. Oh.
Not yet?
Yeah, I see it now. It's right there.
Okay. So, oops, I should block that. Thank you all for being here. I'm super excited to share what is really a work in progress with you all. I feel like so much has happened this year that it feels like a lot to take on a new project, but the ideas have been kind of percolating for a while. And so when I got this invitation, I thought this would be a really good time to bring all of this stuff together, and especially to Africanists and experts who can support a young interdisciplinary scholar as I try to go back to my comm and media studies roots. So the title, Mapping Contemporary Reimaginings of a Global Black Diaspora, really is a nod to the struggle that I have to figure out what the exact dynamics around a Black identity that I'm kind of observing in a number of key sites. So as I said, my work is rooted in communication and media studies, a little bit of STS and HCI. And so this work and my own personal interest in African music and dance really takes me across a lot of interesting places. So I'm always curious about how certain ideas connect and what they can teach us about things that we take for granted in places that people don't really necessarily always think and talk about, both in academia and popular discourse. Sometimes this happens at the level of the global, right? So like, what do we characterize as the global? How do transnational collaborations figure in those characterizations? And then what do they tell us about identity, power, labor, certain ideas? So I'm also curious about how particular moments in time are situated by similarity and differences. So for instance, how do we think about this most recent Black Lives Matter protests, right? So they've been going on for a while from 2015. And we know that, protests against police brutality have been happening since the civil rights movement. But, in thinking about it in the specific moment, right? Like, how is it visible across the globe? I immediately think of what similar histories, recent and prior, can we draw on to understand this particular moment? And at the same time, I'm struck by difference as well. So what sets particular experiences apart? What histories, what particular dynamics render particular sites exceptional and reoccurring, right? Or requiring specific interventions. It's essentially the question is like, what is different about particular moments that seem familiar? So for instance, again, so 20 years ago, it might have taken a while for the world to notice the BLM protests. And similarly to see the End SARS campaign in Nigeria, and that started right after, right? But it really might have taken a while to get the expressions of solidarity, about who's fighting with you. But today, a hashtag tells various groups, that they have support or otherwise. And so these postings, for instance, are by 3 different kinds of diasporic Blacks. So you have on the left, Beyonce's mother, Miss Tina, who's retweeting something by the supermodel Naomi Campbell, who is retweeting somebody who's following Femi Kuti, the son of Fela, on the ground in Lagos as the EndSARS protest is happening. The middle is a hashtag and a collection of art by a Ghanaian returnee, a diasporic returnee who, has been doing interesting work in Accra, bringing together artists. And so her posts are a series of paintings that came out of artists paying attention to EndSARS. And then, the last picture is by a Nigerian American, by that, born in America, parents Nigerian, a singer, rapper, and then seeking to explain how EndSARS is affecting his cousins back home, right? So these kinds of expressions of solidarity, appear specific to the particular medium, Instagram, and the moment in history, right? Contextualized by protest and police brutality. And digital technologies play a really significant role in making these various groups visible to one another. One argument that we'll try to make today is that the uses of the digital allows for reshaping of geographies, right? Hence the word mapping. And it allows for new dynamics of diaspora to sort of recenter around sub-Saharan Africa. I put in brackets because it's a reminder that this is actually not that new, right? The centering of Black origins in Africa never changed. There's been solidarity. We think back to Nkrumah's time, Du Bois, all various, moments of solidarity across the Atlantic Ocean. So it's not a claim that any of this is entirely new. And so the read there is to think about what might be shaping out slightly differently in this particular moment, right? How do we understand some of these dynamics that are coming out? The project really came out of some really simple questions. So like, where can we observe Blacks across the diaspora reaching out to each other, and how are they doing it? And of course, being a media studies scholar, and as you can already guess, it's looking at media and communication technologies. And that's where it's easiest to begin. And then to keep the possibility open for elsewhere that these sort of collaborations and solidarity might actually play out. So where do you observe it, and what does it look like? The second question is, what might we learn about diaspora by looking at these kinds of acts of solidarity and reaching out, right? So certain ideas that are attached to a diaspora, like identity, culture, place, are all relevant to this particular question, and I will talk about them towards the end. So across the spaces that I paid attention to, there were a couple of projects already in play that looked really promising. So I had a fabulous research assistant called Gladys Ngacho Nkadam, who was really interested in how Black Instagrammers were projecting Africa. So she looked at a number of accounts, and together we tried to sort out how Africa was being articulated by both Africans and those in the diaspora. Separately, I noticed that the first Black-owned Canadian cable TV had an interesting take on Blackness. And so I spent a little bit of time digging up together with Gladys what we could find about their operations, and I watched anytime I was in Canada briefly. I was also teaching a course at that time last year, called Global Media Flows. And we were talking, among other things, with students, Nollywood and sounds and music of the Black Atlantic. So looking at Afrobeat and new Nollywood. So altogether, it seemed like I had a number of places where I could start looking and trying to answer these 2 questions. I ended up sort of dividing them into 3. It's somewhat arbitrary because you realize very quickly as I go through that there's a lot of overlap between them, right? You need business today to operate media, and art is business. Media can be art. Art is a type of media, right? So it's just to help me narrow in on specific spaces so that I can actually just talk about it. The key point is that, of course, that the digital permeates all of it, right? So it is what allows for much of the speed of the hashtagging, right? The connection, the way that people collaborate is much easier because they can just slide into DMs on Instagram, send samples, and things get going, right? Other things around globalization also play a role. The ease with which we can travel these days relative to the 60s even, right? And I think those are all important things to consider. So let's get into it. For media, I'm going to be looking specifically at television and film. And of course, I mentioned that social media is suffused through it all. The first is, of course, the most visible, right? So Black Panther's release in 2018 and subsequent success, breaking all kinds of record, I think marked a really key moment in how Blacks around the world are represented in the major studio picture, and most people agree with this. Singular in its production, centering on Blackness, done with a lot of research and respect, right? And that sort of generated some conversation about global Blackness, the place of Black people in the world's imaginations, and how Blacks around the diaspora relate to the continent of Africa. The conversation, particularly on social media, was sustained for a while. And I thought it took most of it said it took too long for this kind of film to come out. But as I was, following along the conversations and, like I said, looking at television in other places, I noticed that there were a number of spaces within traditional media and new media where Blacks were already taking control of representation, which is something that even within the studio system that Ryan Coogler and the actors all in this film were able to project, that they took control of the representation and the narrative itself, right? So for instance, Iroko TV, has been around since 2011 and Fiva TV from around 2013, 2014. So, a slightly different phenomenon, right? But two trans-regional media, a cable channel, which is what Fiva is, and an online distributor of Nollywood, both of them made moves that to me resonate with the same kinds of logics of representation that Black Panther brought. So, Iroko TV is the largest distributor of Nollywood films. It raised millions of dollars and expanded its library and reach to include African diasporic producers and audiences together. So that same period, this is around 2013-14, a cable channel called First Entertainment Voice of Africa, FIVA, was launched in Canada to provide what it called Afrocentric media, primarily from Africa and the Caribbean for Canadian audiences. Within 2 years, FIVA had expanded its distribution to the Caribbean and the United States. Both Iroko and Fiva, to me, emphasize shared African origins for their viewers. And the co-founder and CEO of Fiva proclaimed that the channel aims to provide, quote, provide a clear picture of the social, economical, and political situations that Black people around the world are faced with on a regular basis. Fiva gave itself what it calls the ABC mandate, so Africa, Black, Caribbean, bringing media from Africa and the Black diaspora for their audiences spread across geographies. Like I said, it's available on Canadian cable TV and on a number of OTT platforms, and it is accounted on Monday, available in 17 Caribbean islands via Flow, as well as in the United States. The content is heavily African. So for instance, on the top left there, that's Jocelyn Dumas. She's the Ghanaian TV star. And her show is about, talking about a number of things related to being an African in Africa. The Lekki Wives is sort of, I think it's patterned after the Real Housewives in a way. And Lekki is a suburb of Lagos, if I'm correct. But there are programs drawn from all over. For instance, the documentary on the bottom right, where you see people in carnival attire. It is a show that focuses on Black carnivals, and so they go from Brazil to the U.S. to Nigeria to the Toronto Carnival to Trinidad, effectively mapping out the geographies of the Black diaspora by making sure to connect it back to a carnival in Nigeria. Fiva's founders are of Nigerian descent, but everyone familiar with Toronto knows that there is a strong Caribbean representation, and so I think Fiva tries to really portray that mix. But it is also interesting to see how they mark out imagined territories. So for instance, they have a really tongue-in-cheek reference to BET, which is Black Entertainment Television. So they say there, we are better. And I think it's a dig at what you might perceive as a fairly insular programming for BET. BET focuses very much on American Black culture, right? And this is true for most of American entertainment media. But Fiva is trying to highlight their more expansive view of connecting regions and diasporas, and critically back to Africa, the Africa of today, right? Fiva's Instagram feed is another place to observe, I guess, its politics of a unifying global Blackness. in addition to their business practices, the stuff that people promote on their posts. They seem to emphasize, Black descendant acceptance, solidarity, unity. They put a lot of affirmative videos advocating for, reappropriation of African power. They often give viewers tools and point out things where there are, like for instance, a fact just saying Latinos are Black. They put things that will draw people in to discuss Blackness. They also do shows like, programs on African food in an attempt to teach viewers from elsewhere what's happening on the continent, right? So the emphasis is on similarities of Blackness, but at the same time highlighting differences. There's a lot of celebration of Black women. So it's a really interesting space by itself to observe the way that a particular group of media owners imagine and construct Africa and Blackness in contemporary times. Iroko on its part, like I said, went live in 2011. By 2012, they had 81 employees in Lagos, London, New York. They had raised $8 million, mainly from a US-based hedge fund. And then in 2015, they raised another 19 million from Canal Plus and Kinnevik AB, which is a Swedish VC. So it's really interesting to map out where the money is coming from. It is a video on demand platform. It's available online and has a mobile app. It is also Nigerian owned, but it doesn't reach out to just Nigerians or other Africans for that matter, but Black in the diaspora, right? So it shows Ghanaian films routinely, which these days are kind of considered part of Nollywood, given that a lot of the stars, cross appear in the movies. There's a lot of cross starring, but its investments in 2015 went to original content. So for 300 hours, they commissioned for the year, and this is for local producers, but also producers in the diaspora, so collaborations together. Given new entrance into the Nollywood market and the pervasive online sharing, plus the still pirating of hard copies, which is a feature of Nollywood, Iroko seemed to want to differentiate its content. So the platform design and the way that it functions, until Netflix appeared on the scene, Iroko was thought of as the Netflix of Africa, right? But now Netflix is here making deals with Nollywood stars, and so there's fierce competition. But Iroko stays relevant. People still, go onto Iroko for very specific content. It is known for having accomplished a lot, given the short time that it captured the market. So on YouTube, you'll see a lot of the films. So even if you don't pay for the platform, you can still access some of their films on YouTube, which gives it a wider viewing audience. And half of their audience are outside the continent, right? So the investment in the mobile was to reach the continent viewers, because most people have access to the internet on their phones. It's a very mobile phone continent. But on YouTube, you see that most of the viewers come from all over the diaspora. And I had my students sort of look through this when we talked about it in class. So if you click on any film, you look under the comments, people usually start with like shout outs of where they're from, drawing connections with the storyline, or even just talking to each other in the comments, and they come from all over the world. The top 5 countries, let me see here my notes: United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, and Italy make an appearance, the top 5 appearance in the comments on YouTube. Unlike FIFA though, their posts on social media are very much business focused, right? So it's, creating an environment that gets the audience involved. So, first of all, it's a lot of informative posts like this is what we're showing, or, things that will get audience to participate. What's your favorite ship? What's your favorite relationship? It gives audiences a chance to also engage, but they talk about subscriptions and upgrades. But then we noticed that they also started introducing foreign content on their niche. And so they use the same post across all 3 major social media: Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And so they started including foreign content, but notably it's non-Western content. So it's things like Korean dramas, which some research work shows that it's becoming increasingly popular on the continent. Excuse me, it's a little dry in here. Nollywood, as you all know, it is the second biggest film industry in the world, thousands of films each year, billions of dollars. Reading from Imagweli and Haynes, you can think of Nollywood in 4 eras, right? So there's a colonial era, golden era, the home video era, and now their suggestion is that we are in what they call the new Nollywood era. So this is from the mid 2010s to the present. And new Nollywood is characterized by global platform distribution via places like Iroko, theatrical releases, international film festivals. This film was, it actually premiered in the Berlin Film Festival. And Iroko's catalog is a key aspect of new Nollywood, right? It features a lot of joint productions by Nigerian and diasporic actors and filmmakers. The distribution is increasingly focusing online, where there is more of a diasporic audience. And the feature of Nollywood is to really focus as an inward-looking stance, right? It really lasers in on Nigerian culture as is widely perceived in different ways, various interpretations, different. It's a big industry because it allows producers to move around the country and focus on various local cultures and various topics. So through this platform, Iroko draws diasporic audiences into today's Nigeria and its representational politics and various concerns. So in a way, we can think of this media as key moments, right, in the representation of Blackness in contemporary times. All of them have audiences that span regions, right? But they draw attention to present day Africa both in the representation of the products themselves and the conversations around them. Present day Africa, its cultures and its imaginations, right? The histories are there, but it's very much focused on today's Africa. And social media plays a consistent role in how these different entities and their audiences co-construct an imaginary and representation of Blackness as it is lived in and seen in the diaspora. So what of art, right? I am mostly looking at music and visual art. And in music, I break down it into the sounds and then also the music videos. The visual art I've started looking at, but again, mostly through social media. And now that I'm actually in Ghana here, I mean, COVID is still ongoing, so I can't really do a lot of field work, but I'm hoping to also explore some of the new art that I've seen popping up around Accra and different parts of the country. But for today's talk, I'll focus on things that are most likely visible to this audience. And so the first is kind of like Black Panther got a lot of attention. This is Beyonce's Black is King, a visual album that Beyonce released in as a sort of an addition to The Lion King, which is the remake of The Lion King. The album actually came out first, and I heard it and played it over and over again because I was struck by how many contemporary African musicians were on it before the visual stuff came, and I had mixed feelings about the visuals, and I'll say it. It's interesting because as much as this music spoke to me, I realized that a lot of the visual stuff also really emphasized on things that we would call stereotypically African. So a lot of, in terms of representation, so a lot of animal prints, which isn't to say that animal prints don't exist in our various cultures, but I think there was a lot of emphasis on that. But there also seemed to be a real effort to do what Black Panther did, which is to research particular groups and represent things like the hairstyles, which are really important, right? So you'll see the various hairstyles that she has, and some, the way that kings sit in their thrones. Chieftaincy in Ghana and other parts of Africa are still much in place, and so the visual of that seemed true for an African who is in the diaspora, such as myself. But at the same time, there were some things that you're like, it seems interesting that these are the choices that are made. But as far as the sound, right? So the thing that was striking about the sound, it's very much on point. So who's popular on the continent, specifically for Afrobeat and for dancehall, right? So you go from Shatta Wale, top left, Mr. Easy, who is Nigerian. Shatta Wale is Ghanaian. Mr. Easy is Nigerian, but went to college in Ghana and started out doing shows in Ghana, but now really worldwide and well known. Moonchild and Busisiwa, who are South African, on the bottom right of your screen, and then Tiwa Savage, bottom left. There are other people that I haven't included here. Yemi Alade, for instance, who's really big as well. And so she pairs these individuals with very well-known American artists like Pharrell, Jay-Z, Kendrick Lamar, Childish Gambino, and then up-and-comers like Sienna Majors, right? So the music was a satisfying blend of what is current in Africa right now, again, today's Africa, and not an imagined past Africa, and who is consistently popular in America right now. So a bridging of musical forms and sounds that I think speaks to a particular kind of Black in the diaspora. So one that is versed in contemporary African music, in the African music scene, as well as Afro-American music, particularly rap and R&B. So as I said in the beginning, this isn't necessarily new. There are recent histories of this, and my own personal favorite is a collaboration between Nas and Damian Marley, which was in 2010. The album was Distant Relatives. The first time I watched Black Panther, I thought this album would have made an excellent soundtrack before Kendrick made his own accompaniment. But it's really interesting because of the, if you Google interviews that they both did around the album, they talked about the closeness between reggae and rap, ideas about where each other came from musically, but also in terms of heritage, right? They really emphasize authenticity, realness. And they spoke of connection, about the human race, how we're all connected, how music is connected. At the time, Kanan, the Canadian of Somali roots and waving flag fame, was really popular. And so he had a feature on there as well, and a number of other people, right? So again, there's a history of diasporic Blacks from the Caribbean, the US, reaching out to Africans, who are also in the diaspora, and creating a body of work that is respectful of difference and brings together a hybrid sound. Now, other collaborations from other parts of the diaspora are visible, right? So in our class, we called it the Black Atlantic Collabos. Major Lazer is a group of, there's a white individual, I'm forgetting his name right now. But anyway, but it's also a Black American, so it's a pair of people that make up Major Lazer. And then DJ Maforisa. So the reason why I brought up the race of half of Major Lazer is because this has come up recently on his social media. His children are Black, his partners are, he has Black children. And so some of that has come up in his social media. So there's this narrative of Blackness around them and their music and who they collaborate with frequently. DJ Maforisa is South African, I believe. So it's a really interesting melange, right? So, American, Caribbean, South African, Nigerian, Ice Prince, Patoranking, Judena of Nigerian descent, but Judena is a mixed race. His mother is American, was American, I think she can't remember if she passed away or not, but his dad was a Nigerian chief. And so you see, again, a very interesting mix of styles, and the song itself is really fascinating. In the video, I've added a link, so if anyone wants the slides after I'm done, I'm happy to share it so you can watch it. I don't trust my internet connection enough to navigate out to play the video, so you're just gonna, sorry, unfortunately, just look at the screen grabs, but I've embedded the videos and happy to share the slides so you can listen. Another, collab that my students actually drew my attention to is the song Boasty, which is by, the godfather of grime, so British rap, I guess. Grime is a thing on its own, but if you're familiar with it, so Wiley is like the godfather of it. It features Stefflon Don, who is a Brit of Jamaican descent. Sean Paul, everybody knows who Sean Paul is. Idris Elba, we know him as an actor. He makes a cameo, raps, and says, he wrote his own lyrics. He wasn't a ghostwriter. His wife makes an appearance. She's of Somali descent, raised in the UK and Canada, right? So it looks like a wild mix, but again, the sound and the visuals to me somehow work. And these videos have incredible views on YouTube, and the comments tell you sort of the appetite that is there. And it goes on and on. So I've embedded videos, again, for people who want to see it. Cranium here is a Jamaican reggae art and dancehall singer. Ty Dolla $ign, incredibly popular with UMass undergraduate student, is an African-American rapper. And Wizkid is one of the biggest Afrobeat stars on the continent right now. And so if you do things like go on to say Spotify and you type anything with Afro, you'll see that there's now a range of things. So this is Afro pop, Afro bashment, it's Afro swing, Afro everything. And then the list, if you look closely, they often always, and this is incredible for the sheer quantity of it. I was actually blown away just by looking at, how many of these are there into our class. We tried to put together our own playlist, Black Atlantic, and you'll see again, similar collaborations across the spectrum. So you'll see British, French, Blacks collaborating with Afrobeats, African based in Africa, Jamaicans, North America. It goes on and on. And the East. And so if you read around the way that these things come, you'll hear things like, yeah, no, I listened to these things. Or my boy or my friend or my girl here turned me on to this person and I liked it, and then I slid into their DMs, I sent them a sample, and all of a sudden we had something really juicy and we put it out, and here we are, right? And so there's some relative ease and fluidity with which these kinds of collaborations are coming up about. And so the norm seems to be, you feature on one person's album and then you do another track, right? So Burna Boy has been doing a lot of these back and forth with a number of people, from Georgia Smith, and the styles can be radically different, but somehow they still manage to make it work. If we go back to Beyonce's Black is King right now, if we, I made some comments about the visuals, but it's a little bit complicated because on the back end, the people that collaborated with her are also a mix of African. It's not just Beyonce imagining what Africa looks like, right? It is with African creatives and African-American creatives, hyphenated African-Americans, so Ghanaian American, Nigerian American, or, African-American in the generic way that it's used in the US. So you have Bliss, the ambassador, who, Ghanaian descent, but a filmmaker, rapper, singer, to Joshua Kisi, who is a stylist, photographer, a number of different people. So the influences, it's a little hectic, actually. So I had a friend, a Latina friend, who said she wasn't sure that this was made for her, but she appreciates that a lot of work went into it. And for me, I immediately recognized it as something meant for someone such as myself, who, like I said before, pays attention to what's happening on the continent on the daily, but lives in a different part of the world where I'm surrounded by a different kind of Blackness and a different kind of representation of Africa, right, of being in America. And when I was in college, I went to college in the US in grad school, and I teach there. When I started college, the imagination that people had about Africa, by the time I finished grad school, it was a completely different understanding. And, the first years of college, people didn't want to be associated with Africa. And, by the time I was done with grad school, everybody that I knew, including people from the same spaces, wanted to go to Africa. So something had switched in the time that, in the decade or so that I was schooling and trying to figure out, so to me, it's like going back to all of these things and trying to figure it out in the moment as I see these things playing out. Black is King is not the first time that Beyonce, or her sister for that matter, have reached into the continent, right, for either the sound or the visuals. And I use Beyonce because she's probably the biggest Black star in the world at this point. And so, for the Girls We Run This World, there are two, I believe, Congolese dancers who she found on YouTube, brings them in. She's known for bringing the twins, who are Black French, on her tours. And below is a video by Solange on her Losing You video, which was filmed in Soweto with dancers who, to me, kind of look like the Saperes from Congo, if anyone's familiar with that. But there again, so now focusing on visuals as opposed to the sounds, you'll see, again, similarities. So Sierra, who's I guess quintessential R&B singer, also filmed in Soweto recently, did a song with techno, and the visuals are meant to, as far as I can read, an homage to Africa and a blending of styles. Tiana Taylor does a similar thing, and where you see a mix of the stereotypical, right, the hats and the things and the paints, but you also see attempts to sort of reach out in particular groups. So it might be Igbo, or Yoruba in terms of the wearing of the red, specific cultures within the continent are tapped into for these visuals. And it's, again, contemporary. So here we have Rihanna and Childish Gambino doing the Gwara Gwara, which was hugely popular last year. I think it's still popular. If you do 10 top dances for Africa on YouTube, Gwara Gwara from South Africa will show up. And so again, visuals for popular Black stars incorporate things from popular African culture. It's a mix of music and dance, something that young people on the continent can recognize, fusing it with things that people all over the diaspora, whether they have an immediate link being born of a parent or born on the continent, or being generations removed, being the descendant of slaves, right? So the mixing is really interesting there. One point about dancing and dressing, which I've already hinted at, which it's a complication for me, and I don't really know how to put it in within what we're talking about here, and I'm hoping for some comments. So for instance, Pilolo, which is another street dance, which is really popular on YouTube, showed up in Janet Jackson's, I want to say, Made for Now video. And her dancers, again, dressed in Ankara and again, sort of like the African garb, if you will, lots of animal print. But if you notice all of the videos on YouTube posted by young people doing these dance challenges, and that's predominantly how these dances come about. It's, you know, off the streets of Accra, Johannesburg, and then someone does a video and then it goes online, it becomes viral, and then somehow it gets incorporated into a huge star's work. Sometimes they're brought in, but because it's popular culture, I'm not sure attribution necessarily happens, but the internet is very fast on drawing lines between where they think people got inspiration from. So actually this particular reference was done by the people who put up the top 10 African dances. And so, you know, but you'll notice what I was trying to say was that the young people in the videos are typically dressed just like the Americans would if they're not filming a video, which is, you know, in what you would call global youth culture. It's t-shirts, sneakers, right? And yet when these stars do these videos and take these dances, you know, they always have this particular animal print thing going on. So I'm trying to understand which vernaculars make it into the diaspora music videos and collaborations and which ones don't. Not all of them are like that, right? But some of them certainly are. And the street dancing is part of viral culture on YouTube right now. So we have all the way from Azonto to now Jerusalem. If you haven't seen any of these, I highly recommend that you go on YouTube right away. And especially Jerusalem, which is a South African song. I believe these young people are from Angola, if I'm not sure. If I'm wrong, someone correct me. But all of a sudden, there are like hundreds of videos from different parts of the world where people are copying these dances. But the key point about it, you know, that I want to make is that when Paul Gilroy kind of revisited the question of the Black Atlantic in 2006, I read that he kind of sounded a bit pessimistic, right? So, you know, there seemed to be a fear that what we think of as Black expressive culture is no longer able to resist co-option or co-optation, if you will. And so, you know, the way that certain aspects of Black culture get reused and remixed to him was sort of a problem that, you know, was really tied to material consumption. It glamorizes a number of different things like sexism and some worrying trends that came up there. You know, while I think there is a conversation to be had about these sort of creative borrowing, and I've just kind of hinted that I also struggle with how it's done. I'm not really sure what to characterize it. I still think that much of it is characterized by efforts at collaboration as opposed to co-optation. And there's even the question of, you know, whether a Black African descendant co-opts an African culture, right? And that debate also went on online quite a bit after a satirical essay went up online. So there is that conversation to be had. But because a lot of the work in especially the music space is less of these stereotypical images. So for instance, I talked about this Major Lazer production. The team that produced the video is a mix of people of African descent and otherwise, right? But the final visual is a mix of nothing too particular. I mean, you see the Ghana flag, but you also see flags from different parts of the world. When I first watched this video, I couldn't tell if it was Johannesburg that it was filmed in or it was Brooklyn. And I think it was done on purpose, right? And so perhaps Gilroy's concern is valid here, but on the other hand, you could think of it as perhaps trying to not be too specific, but rather highlight that, and this is the key thing, is that everybody in the video was Black. Everybody was vibing to the music. The dances were familiar. And so there is a particular kind of Blackness that these music collaborations seem to be representing. And a lot of it taps into present day urban culture that young people in Africa seem to be really on top of. And so, you know, all the music and dance styles, you know, their mixes and their hybridity, the transnational flows here, for me, are another key place to see how particular forms of Blackness are being imagined. And so, you know, there's a part, like I said before, visual art, but I'm still sort of collecting data on that, so I'll leave it. But I did take a screen grab for some of the art to show you where my mind's at. But essentially, the music collaborations and the visual representations of these videos, I think, are productive for understanding, again, how perhaps these notions of reaching out for solidarity between Blacks of the diaspora and young Blacks in Africa today, how that particular dynamic is playing out. On the business end, or what I'm calling business, is mostly focused on the business of return. So there's been an uptick of a lot of transatlantic events around organized by states or travel enterprises. You know, a lot of interesting events, and the biggest one that I think most of you will be familiar with, because I did notice that there was a tea time talk on your page where you talked about the year of return, and I was in Ghana for the year of return. And so this is from some of my observations while being on the ground, and for also sort of you know, participating on the ground, but also sort of tracking the conversations around it. So the year of return was put together by the Ghana Tourism Board to mark the 400th year of commemorating the arrival of the first documented enslaved Africans to Jamestown, Virginia, I believe. And it on the ground, it did feature a lot of high profile returnees, right? So, and this covered a range of returnees in a sense, because it included what you might call the heritage returnees. So, you know, descendants of slaves who don't necessarily know exactly where their roots are. They may not be able to identify that they came from the Akan people or the Ewa people, but know that they're from a particular place. So, and then it was, you know, Caribbean folks. So these folks from the Caribbean, Caribbean in Americas. And then it was people with a direct parental lineage, right? So for instance, Boris Kojo in the middle there, Jaimon Hansu, and Judena at the top there all have African parentage, right? Akon, right? And Lupita Nyong'o has Kenyan parents, right? I saw her on the beach while I was here, which is pretty cool. But then you also, and so like I said, you also have the groups that, you know, it might be through marriage. So for instance, Ludacris's wife, Eudoxie, is from Guinea. And so their tracking of the time they were in Ghana for the year of return was a mix of family and understanding the return for Ludacris, who is from a different kind of lineage, right? Popcorn up top is, reportedly bought an apartment in Ghana. And I think for me that follows, Rita Male moving to Ghana in a place that's not too far from my own parents' home, and of course Beyonce's mom. And so there was a lot of mixing, but the high profile essentially, right? So celebrities showing up a lot, and two people seem to be key in sort of promoting this. And so Bozoma St. John, who is a marketing executive. And Boris Kojo, who I already mentioned, whose dad was a Ghanaian, and Bozoma's mom and dad are both Ghanaian. And so, it played a key role in sort of linking the year of return to entities such as Essence, a preeminent Black publication, and creating celebrations and events around the year of return to coincide, right? So Full Circle Festival, which emphasized return, but also ongoing connections with the continent, right? How do we, and I attended a number of panels where people already started talking about beyond the return. How do we move on after this celebration of concerts and so on and so forth? How do we remain engaged? How do we keep the return going? This was all before COVID sort of broke out and limited travel, right? The year of return is not new. It follows a very long history of Panafest, for those of you familiar with this. A historical celebration that began in the 90s, and it was done essentially every 2 years. And I think it's still ongoing, although it's sort of diminished in visibility over time. And prior to these events, we also noticed a number of Black-owned and Black-focused businesses promoting international travel, a lot of them to ancestral homes, as they phrase it, and Travel Noir specifically had a lot of experiences within the year of return as part of their business, right? But essentially, it's about experiencing Blackness through travel in different parts of the world. So in spaces that may have been denied certain diasporic Blacks, but centers on millennial Blacks specifically, right? And so when you navigate the website, on their programming, on the app, You see diasporic Blacks from, again, all over. It's across the Atlantic, so the Americas, Caribbean, Europe, and Africa as well. And it's not done separately. There's a lot of reaching out and holding of hands, if you will. So, but the notion here is of return, and return is configured in many different ways. So essentially, how do we sort of make sense of these different things, right? So how do we connect these instances of connection across, traditional media, if you will, arts, music, and return, the business of return? Thinking of the ease of transnational connection afforded by digital media and the seeming uptick in these sorts of collaborations. For me, and specifically, what can we learn about, as I said before, identity, culture, and place? I think for me, a good place to start is Stuart Hall, right? Cultural studies, and the initially written in 1996 essay on diaspora and cultural identity. And I like that conceptualization of identity as a state of becoming, as a process, something that is always in production. And I think, it's really an astute observation in that sense, right? The second part of that essay talks about how it is a positioning, right? Specifically, how we position ourselves to the path, for instance, a shared origin, which we see in these collaborations. But it's also about celebrating difference. And this is something that I read from the different sites, how these various collaborations simultaneously celebrate a shared space of Africa and contemporary Africa, not the past Africa where people are descended from. That's what draws people together in its most basic form. But the practices of connection are around contemporary African culture as it's seen today. And so this is the presence African, as Hall puts it, right? Borrowing from, I believe, Leopold Sedar Senghor and Aimé Césaire. And it's visible in song, dance, dress, religion, right? For me, it's the difference there is also celebrated, and the difference, allows people to have a discussion and confrontation of struggles that the different sides that they come from also bring, right? Hall talks about how all of this is constituted to representation. And so the way that the films and the televisions that I began with also portray this present day Africa as far as the diaspora sees it. It played the key role in how people construct this notion of being Black and being a Black of African descent specifically. In thinking through this, hybridity also comes to mind, right? So, Hall talks about hybridity in that essay as well. And I immediately think of K. Anthony Appiah and Taye Selassie. And I know a lot has been written about hybridity, so I'm not claiming that they're the only ones who taught about it, like Homi Bhabha, Ulrich Beck, Ajana Padrai, all of those folks. But I'm focusing really on work on African diaspora as far as I can lay hold on it. Appiah's notion that all cultures are hybrid, shaped by people, commodities, and ideas, right? And, I read that as a critique against national identities, right? In part because the essay talked a lot about the notion of he calls it contamination, which may not be necessarily the best word, but essentially it also privileges the individual, right? It says the individual experience at its core. And I believe this is sort of bracketed by what you might think of as current geopolitics. And this comes up in the way that Taye Selassie spoke about the Afropolitan, right? So she started initially by talking about three dimensions that the Afropolitan sort of identified with. It's the national, the racial, the cultural, with subtle tensions in between. It's attached to how you're raised, how you're approximate to others, how you choose your accent, so on and so forth. In a later talk, which I watched with my students, she revised this to say it's, Afropolitanism is defined by locality. And so she asked that we use 3 R's, rituals, relationships, and restrictions, and not to geopolitics, to kind of, operationalize that through the question, where are you sort of local, right? And it's still centered on the individual lived experience, right? But how are you local through your rituals, through your relationships, and through your restrictions? I would argue that those 3 R's actually just center around affect, which itself is tied to identity and place. By affect here, I'm talking about feeling, emotion, attachments. Sarah Ahmed has argued that affect is activated in encounters with difference. be it in bodies or places, right? It affect positions and organizes our relationships. And it's not just about individual bodies, although it is important, right, of the individual individual affects place is important, but it also positioned within representation and power structures, and the way that those individual bodies live with each other and the power structures that they live within, right? So affect takes place within encounters. I read an excellent dissertation recently by Millitz, where she says, collective affect shapes feelings of belonging and alienation, right, to a nation state or to an imagined place. And it's a really interesting connection. So for me, identity, as Hall describes it, is relational, and to me, so is affect, right? But there are all of these synergies and overlaps between the way that we've conceptualized cultural identity, affect, and I think they also all link to place as well. Feminist scholars have found that if there is a politics of becoming in place, and it is a way of being, I think, attendant to geography, relations, symbolic positionality, right, of a particular place, community building. And so it's sort of the way that politically disenfranchised people recognize and gain autonomy. And this is from Gibson Graham. Yu Fu Tuan, who is a human and cultural geographer, has argued that human experience is how people attach meaning to space and place. So sensation, perception, conception, all of these make up experience, and all of these encompass emotion and thought. So where you are matters spatially, geographically, as it does metaphorically and symbolically, right? It is your social, economic, and political world that is made real in the everyday, and it shapes how you encounter other people. So personal experience, as it's become positioned within the spaces that I examined, have become really salient for how diasporas encounter each other, but how they also encounter particular places, and in this case, present day contemporary Africa. When you look at the commentary on digital platforms, emotions are very much tied to how the diaspora responds to these artistic and media collaborations. So for instance, this particular author speaks of when Beyonce sings, "You're welcome to come home to yourself," it released what they call ancestral shame as the descendants of slaves, not knowing exactly where they come from. And linking that to the sense of relief of going into the Lesotho, even though not having any direct link to the Lesotho, and being told, "Welcome home." So the centering around contemporary Black African culture, as far as I see it, allows it to be a meeting point of different and various diasporic groups, a way to reconnect with that shared identity, that is rooted in contemporary practice more so than history, as I've said, and taking advantage of the digital affordances of being able to quickly reach out and collaborate in a way to build solidarity around this identity that seems to constantly be evolving, constantly being changed. It's not fixed, and none of the events there that I attended or read around made the suggestion that there's an essential Africanness to ascribe to. Rather, the discussions were around crafting and building your own identity to the Africa that you see today, and linking it back to your own experiences in the far-flung parts of the diaspora that you are from. And so the centering on present-day culture, I'm trying to make this argument that it is what helps, the movement of these various affects, right? And there are many: nostalgia, longing, empathy, solidarity, rage. All of these things meeting at that cultural center rejuvenates concern for lives lived around the Atlantic and the various ways that they are configured, whether it's against violence or against strife. So in essence, what I'm trying to say here, by trying to link cultural identity, affect, and place, is to say that contemporary sub-Saharan Africa is where a shared joy and recognition gets to be marked, right, and celebrated. And through this, it allows some work to go into getting it right, enabling a deeper connection with the diaspora. So different groups of diaspora come together around the music and dance of contemporary Africa, and through that work their way through solidarities in their various sites. The key challenge of this argument is showing how this displacement of affect takes place, right? And I've been looking closely at some of the posts and the discussions online to make sense of this. But I think if there is a sort of, if you think of, and I use the metaphor of a fulcrum, which could be terribly wrong, in the sense that The expression of contemporary African culture is the force in the middle, right? That is balancing the two, the diasporic affects and the different affects, the diasporic, coming together and the affects that it does displaces, right? So you come together to express cultural identities through contemporary Africa, and by this coming together allows you to then work out the tensions and the various affects of being of another place, right? And so this is really the key tension of the work that I need to kind of work out. But the goal has been so far to like work my way through the way that the representations, the collaborations, the connections, essentially transatlantic solidarity, which has always been there. Look at how these things, how they live on, how they are reignited and reshaped by what looks like an easier mode of connectivity, right? And so this, and allowing the various Black diasporas to come and recenter their expressions of creativity around what the youth in Africa are doing, allows them to experience and move and physically come to Africa through the business of return, to be able to express the various affects of being torn or being separate from the culture. I'll end here, which is really where, again, like I said, the challenge of moving forward with this project is, but I wanted to share all of these ideas with you and then hear what you might have to say about it. So really thank you for your attention, for giving me the opportunity to work through something that's been waiting to happen for a long time. I just haven't been able to fully get it together, and I look forward to your comments. I will stop sharing the screen now. So here we go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Avle. This was a very fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. And please write your questions on the Q&A, or if you raise your hands, that's also another possibility. And while we wait for the questions to start coming, I concur with your analysis that something has changed. And that made me think about Chimamanda Adichie's very famous TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, when she talked about her roommate, And myself, I have also experienced that. And just yesterday, I was helping my brother from Senegal to order something. And I was asking for the code and the shipment. And I was like, it's going to be shipped to Senegal, which is in Africa. And the guy literally laughed at me. I know. He told me, I know. Senegal is in Africa. But at the beginning, really, I had to clarify.
Explain and point where Africa where Senegal is. Yeah, I know that experience very well.
So I really understand this fact. And if I understood well your argument, like this and others, these collaborations, like this embrace of, definitely played a role. But I was just asking about how you look at class, like in your research, like who is collaborating, who has access, does class, or the fact that it's on spaces like Instagram and it's music, it's dance, does that play a role in what? So I'm just trying if you have about that, the popular class aspect at the same time.
It seems really complicated to me because in music and the arts that I focused on, it's really famous people, right? Janet Jackson, Beyonce, and all of these. But at the same time, when you look on YouTube, which is where I guess the popular gets is more visible, it's like those young people in their home doing Jerusalema dance that goes viral. And it is, it's hard to tell what social class, but you can make inferences from, the environment that they're in. I think it's happening on multiple levels because for once, the uber elites have access to this everyday working middle class Africa that perhaps before they were disconnected from. And that is potentially part of the draw, I think, where it's like, oh, I recognize something about the way that they're dancing. It's entirely different circumstances, but there's something drawing me to it, and I want to be part of it. And African youth are very versed in global
culture. Like if you've talked to it's incredible, just the difference talking to young people in different parts of the world. But African youth are online, are looking at the latest song that comes from any country, they already know. So, you know, there's been already for them looking out towards the diaspora in many ways. But I think now the diaspora is doing this return in an interesting way where it's bringing multiple classes together that in the past wouldn't, you know. In the year of return, I noticed it, you know, like on the beach with Lupita Nyong'o, with like the Labadi boys on the same beach. I'm not sure this would happen in, you know, like the different classes being in the same space and feeling safe in the same space, right? So there's something, I don't know, yeah, but I think there's reaching across classes too, if we, it could be, but I need to look more closely at, you know, some, for instance, the comments online and the photos that I've been collecting as well to see. A really good question.
Thank you so much. And now, Dr. Kalumbu, I think we have some questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Avle. My name is Isaac Kalumbu. I will be reading the questions that are coming in for you. So the first question comes from Nemata Blyden, and the question is, what you talk about is in many ways similar to how those in the diaspora engaged with Africa historically. That is an imagined Africa. The digital of course allows for a visual now. Do you have some thoughts on this?
Let me make sure I got it. Yeah. So what I'm observing is how the diaspora is reacting to an emergent Africa, right? So the characterization is of Africa as emergent. So I've heard that phrase a lot. And for me, the notion of an emergent Africa is problematic in a number of ways. And it's very common to use that phrasing of the global south, right? So it's emerging from some kind of past or, I don't know, different era or different time. And James talks about in the different uses of times that Africa and the South seem to be heading towards like a development, which is the North. And, you know, I think cultural studies folks like to trouble that assumption quite a bit. But I think it is, so I'm not sure like what Africa is necessarily emerging from or going to. It is a different time, which the whole world is changing, right? So I would argue that various societies around the world are also emergent in different ways. Some are emergent out of a positive past and some are emergent out of a negative past. It depends on how you characterize it. America is emerging into something, you know, so it depends on how we're using the word emergent. If it's an economic term or cultural term, I'm unclear. But I like to trouble that term a lot.
No, the term was imagined.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, unless it's, maybe the person can explain a little bit more, but
okay.
Because when you say emergent, I ask emergent from what or from where? That's kind of my reaction to the word.
Yes, I get you. And but I think what the questioner is getting at is that, you know, the relationship between Africa and those in the diaspora in the past was based on an imagination of Africa, an imagined.
Oh, imagination, I'm sorry.
Yes, an imagined Africa.
I am so sorry, I heard it totally.
So they're asking, what are your thoughts about that idea of this imagined Africa?
Gotcha. Well, that took a terrible turn. That was not the word.
No, but that was actually
I'm so sorry.
No,
Yeah.
Dr. Avle, I appreciated what you said there because that actually revealed some of the problems that are arising from this interaction that's happening. You know, seeing Africa as relegated to some space that it is emerging from. You know,
Yeah.
Again, that's sort of a negative spin. So that's not lost. That's actually quite valuable. What you pointed, but just shifting your attention now to this idea of an imagined Africa.
Yeah, that's a very, it's very much on point. And this is why I began with Hall, Stuart Hall. I think in that essay, there was a line that he made about, the connection that he perceives of the diaspora in Africa. At the time he wrote it was of not an imagined Africa, but the Africa of today. And I see reflections of that quite a bit. And so I think that's where the tension that I have with the videos, right? So when I see videos of what we say stereotypical African wear, the prints and the Serengeti, but at the same time, there is a careful attention now to understanding what the hairstyles mean, that if you make your hair a particular way, or if you pierce your ear a particular way, understand, like a closer attention to cultural detail. And I think it is no longer around and imagined, because you get access and contact with present Africa through the young people online, right? And that was perhaps the barrier. And this is why I said the digital is a key feature, because prior to the 1990s, you had to rely on a network's interpretation, the BBC's interpretation of Africa, or even till today, the New York Times representation of Africa, of like wildness and war and whatever. But you can bypass all that if you wanted, and directly just hang out if you wanted online with young people. So the increased internet access in Africa is a key way of closing that. It's still there. I mean, I'm not pretending that those don't exist, but I think there are more opportunities to comprehend today's Africa as young people are living it versus what you think the diaspora might imagine it to be. Yeah.
That's really great. Thank you. And the next question is actually quite connected to this phenomenon, because the questioner asks, how do we start educating ourselves about the stereotypes that are presented to the diaspora by the media? And when you showed that clip with Beyonce and those men dressed in that African print, I was struck by that. Even vehicle is African print, animal print.
Yeah.
The dress in animal print. Africa, animals being synonymous with Africa. This continuum of the narrative of Africa is equals to animals, and forgetting that there are people who live there, there are cultures, people have language, people have taboos and values, and they work in various environments, in factories, in universities, in municipalities, as well as in the fields and in the mines and wherever else. So there's something that's going on there that is positive, in that it's bringing African diasporic peoples together, but sometimes the coming together is coming in terms that are hinted by ways of thinking of the past, negative, that continue to perpetuate this notion.
I mean, that is the struggle against colonization and white supremacy, to be honest, right? It's generations of being taught that is what Africa represents. And because there was a barrier between groups, the diaspora and Africa, that imagination could take hold, right? And it could be believable. Now, when I look at comments online, it's not just Africans saying, yo, hold up, that's nonsense. It's also African Americans. It's also British, Black Brits, Black Europeans, Caribbean. So I think if, just the opportunities, increased opportunities for collaboration and being open to learning, I think is a way, it depends on what the audience is. If you're talking about how do we undo this for people of Black descent, I think the work is slightly different than for non-Blacks. Because for as I've seen through these collaborations and reaching out and returning, there is a desire to also go beyond that narrative. I think the diaspora is restless and uncomfortable with it, and so that's why you're seeing the collaborations. And I think it's really productive that especially African Americans with immediate links, so the parentage and the grandparents, the people who have family, right? So the immigrants essentially who bridge the two are doing because it looks like they're the key ones correcting some of these things, right? So the Joshua Kisses, the Blitz, the ambassador, the Tiwa Savage, returnees, people who straddle both the diaspora and the continent in its realness, collaborating with their diasporic siblings. That's where I see the change happening, because it won't happen by just watching the media, and also having a stake in it. So FIFA is really important to be a, Black owned television whose sole purpose is to connect Africa and the diaspora. It's brilliant and it's beautiful because it allows that education. It's problematic in some ways too, I'll be honest, about watching some of the content, but I think it's doing critical work, which ownership or having a space within media is key. If you can't control representation to some extent, it's really difficult. So being able to produce in the traditional spaces, so having Ryan Coogler at the helm of Black Panther is important, right? Having Lupita in it is important. Danai Gurira in it is important, right? Because each of them plays a different kind of role in getting the representation as close as possible to something that is not ridiculously stereotypical. And yeah, so it's multiple things that will help, but having a stake in the formal places of representation, as well as on the informal places like YouTube and Instagram. All of the Black Instagrammers are telling a really interesting story. Their representation of Africa and Blackness, when we looked at their accounts versus everybody else, when they use the word Africa, my goodness. It was animals and Serengeti versus people, like you mentioned, people, homes, so like it was humanized representation in the Instagram study. So it's really important to have a stake and to speak within that space. And that's the only way to change that, I think. Really long answer, apologize.
No, this is great. Thank you so much. I have a question that I wanted to pose, which has to do with the fact that prior to this digital explosion, this social media explosion, we didn't have too many of these collaborations going on. And I'm not necessarily ascribing their presence to, the social media explosion, but I'm juxtaposing the, that you mentioned after 2010 to the period prior to that. There were much fewer collaborations between people of African descent across the board. But having said that, I also want to underscore that such collaborations have a long history that we could miss. I'm reminded from your talk by a African-American choir leader named Orpheus Makadu, who went to South Africa in 1896 and toured South Africa with his Jubilee singers, the arranged spiritual tradition, which then helped create what we now know as Imbuve or Istatamia, the Ladysmith Bazo style of singing. There's a space there for cultural integration, hybridization, or syncretism, whichever way people want to look at it. And in this specific case, we see that it actually helped create a tradition, because the Zulu tradition is very vocal. It's choral. They use more voices than they use instruments, and so this was a natural connection between African American spirituals and the Zulu tradition. So those two merged and created the whole Ladysmith Black Mambazo type genre. Do we see this musical syncretism happening right now, or is it just a simple popular artist meets the next popular artist and they are making music?
I think the styles are being influenced a little bit. I have to look a lot closer at the various genres. There's always been influence, right? So if you talk to music scholars who talk about jazz and all, the Afro roots of various kinds of sounds around the diaspora, but you're talking about a different kind where a diasporic kind of sound came in and influenced a very localized type of music.
Right.
I think it's been going both ways for a while, because, you know, for instance, hip life, hip life, which is I guess the root, I don't know what word to use, the one that birthed Afrobeats, if you will, right? So it's a combination of hip hop and rap and high life, right? The high life of, Mensa, I'm forgetting all my parents are so annoying right now. All the CK Man, all of those bands, right?
Yes.
And then Reggie Rockstone kind of puts together his experience in living in the UK, starts making this crazy mix of really fast rap on high life, which everybody's like, whoa, what is that? And then slowly I see that hip life morphing into Afrobeats, which is linked to Fela's own Afrobeats without the S, right? Fela had his own type, but Afrobeats, as we know it now, is a mix of R&B, rap, high life, hip life with its own quirks and nuances, and it's its own blend. And now I'm hearing that in Drake's music and all of the big Beyonce's music, like the record she created with Black is King is not a Beyonce record, as far as I can tell. It's a very interesting mix of Mr. Easy and Tiwa, and so it's happening both ways, and I think that's always happened, but I think it's accelerated for us to see in different ways now, because it seems to be happening faster and faster and proliferating. To me, it seems a little bit faster than, because I grew up, in the 90s. Hip life took a long time to become Afrobeats, but now, it seems a little faster. But I'm not a musicologist or a historian, so I'm sure if I read more, I'll find perhaps a more detailed analysis. But it's a really good way, and the history part is always, important. I need to go even further than the 60s and 70s, which I've read a little bit around. But yeah, it's always been there. And someone in the comments said, don't forget the Afrocentric trends of the 1980s. Yeah, and I think that particular point is helpful in that question about imagined and sort of a view, because the Afrocentric trend of the 80s in my head reflects a lot of those imagined space of what Africa is, right? Black, coming out of the Black Panther movement and the celebration of Blackness as a militant response to white supremacy, and sort of like wearing certain clothes, naming your children a particular way, using African sounding names. It played a particular role, but I think that era was a good example of where it was largely based on an imagination of what Africa is. Whereas these days, you have people tapping into like day names as opposed to made constructed names, right, in particular cultures. And so, yeah, there's a continuity there that, really a much more studious attempt at this will like do a nice historic from the 1800s all the way, of popular culture, music, naming. We have a good record of the politics, right? In Nkrumah, all this, that's really well documented. I'm not sure the popular culture part, at least I haven't seen a lot of it, and I would really love to read something that does the kind of detailed analysis for a longer period.
Great.
So really great questions.
Yes, let's move on to yet another question here. Thank you for your informative presentation. Please comment on how TikTok blends into your research, especially on how it is providing everyday young Africans a platform to share their lived experiences, interrupt stereotypes, showcase their talents globally.
It's really funny that you mentioned TikTok. I had a hidden slide on TikTok because I was talking to a friend yesterday and she sent me a TikTok video of a Kenyan man doing a dance to a Savage's Korobo song. Let me see if she's on. Cindy's not on here, but and I thought, it was really, and so I was like, I haven't paid attention to TikTok. And she said, well, you're missing out because this is where all of this stuff is happening. And so I went into TikTok and started scrolling. And because I'm currently in Accra, of course, the algorithm tailored it to show me the Ghana TikToks, which is quite hilarious, what people are doing on TikTok. But it's an important site. And in my other work, I'm realizing that as much as I've been paying attention to Instagram and YouTube, for a while, Snapchat was the place to be, but no longer. So being really aware of where the young people are is a good way to tap into and understand how these things are changing. So TikTok has a lot of videos of young Africans, doing bits, and that's the beauty of TikTok. There's no real, it's just do whatever you want, anything goes. And if people watch it, and the algorithm is not abstract. Of course, it's written by people, but the way it's written surfaces particular things that they deem are popular. And the humor, I realized that the Ghanaian humor is very particular when it shows up on TikTok versus when it shows up on YouTube. So there are really interesting differences. And I would love for a student to work on this as a project, looking at, the various ways that Blackness and Africanness shows up on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, all the places that young people hang out. I think that would be a really cool project. But I haven't analyzed it, is the short answer.
Thank you very much. Here is another question. Do you envisage African and diasporic reconnections evolving into a fundamental force for economic and political transformations on the continent, especially when we consider dismal conditions in the places like Democratic Republic of Congo and related issues of dictatorial rule?
I think so. I think there is a possibility there. I saw it in, at least when I participated in the Year of Return, I saw it in, they had these little round tables where there seemed to be people who wanted to move past the entertainment factor and say, okay, we have real work to do. And a lot of the participants in these were either returnees who, there were a few people who had relocated and had started working in various places. So that's one space. And there are people who seem to be pushing investment. I'm not sure about intervening in politics as we know it, in the big P politics. Those are very much tied around entrenched elites that, I'm not, I don't know, maybe some people have access. So for instance, I mentioned Bozoma and Boris Kodjo and the president of Ghana, giving them a shout out. There's some connection. They both met him, and there might be some possibility on the elite level, maybe in that kind of politics. But in various aspects, like in the economy, I saw quite a few mentions of investments or starting things. The last roundtable I attended was with Akala, who is a British grime rapper, and his manager, and some leftist thinkers. Some adventurers. It was a ragtag group of people, academics, including myself, just talking about moving beyond sort of the optics and doing the real work of changing lives. So there's some enthusiasm for coming together to talk about substantive issues. Not that popular culture isn't, right? Because I think you can actually have a lot of influence through that. But I think I did see efforts to organize around other kinds of logics to try and intervene. And essentially the desire is to improve life on Africa, the continent itself, right? Because poverty is real, and that's something that perhaps is the one thing that is, perhaps consistent maybe with the imagination and the reality. But I think also the incredible wealth, which as a returnee myself is like mind-blowing. So it's the inequality that's the problem, I think. There's incredible, ridiculous amounts of wealth on the continent, side by side with incredible amounts of poverty. So there's a will to erase some of that inequality. So I think there's possibility there. I think so.
And we are reminded of Oprah Winfrey's school in South Africa, which is a significant investment and contribution. I think somebody like Akon is talking about building a city in Senegal.
Yeah, so the big stars have the advantage of moving And this is where the affects, right? So they have the opportunity to move resources and various affects towards a particular project. And that's the work that they do. But they can only do so much. And I'm not always sure that what they do is what is needed, right? I think I've seen interesting and perhaps more impactful things within, for instance, the returnee group in Accra, where it is various kinds of diasporic individuals, both like people who were born outside or who went to school. And they've been doing really fascinating things like mentorship for secondary school students, just helping them with their exams. Like basic things that are quite impactful down the line. And they're not big investments per se, but they've realized that by returning to their communities that, they've noticed a need for mentorship for young students in finishing their exams, like things like on the everyday. And I think those are really impactful. It's helpful that ACON and Program Free have money to do those things. I'm not saying those are bad, but I think and they're not that many relative to the rest of us. So it's more important to encourage collaboration in spaces where people have shown that there is a need, right? So it's not to unilaterally say, I'm going to give you a school. When you say that, it's just like the same developmental challenge that I've always sort of critiqued is, I'm not coming to tell you that you need a school. If you tell me that you need clean water, I would rather figure out how to get you clean water first. And I think the Diaspora group has this attitude, which for me is quite impactful for the young people that they hang out with and help with their, applications and homework, and just having a positive person in your life outside of your immediate circle. I've seen it have really good outcomes.
All right. Well, I do not see any more questions, so I think we have answered.
I think Shingi has a question.
Okay, can you go ahead, Shingi?
Thank you so much, team, and thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, Doc. Really enjoyed it. And the reason why I wanted to ask vocally is because I thought it could be a mouthful. I want to work through my ideas as I ask this question.
Sure.
And I say this as somebody who's a scholar of global blackness and who's also an artist. When we had a meeting earlier in the summer, and there was a lady from Ghana there who was a journalist, and she was talking about the year of return. And she had said when Samuel L. Jackson was there, he had taken some pictures of just some things you were seeing, but a lot of folks felt that, a lot of Ghanaians and other Africans that felt that he was poorly representing the space, because he could take pictures of this as a more sophisticated things, but he's taking pictures of maybe things that were more run down, or people who, and he had responded like, I'm taking pictures of things that fascinate me. That's the first thing, right? But the reason I'm saying that is when we talk about this representation, I always feel that art is almost inherently exaggerated representations of things, right? And I'm saying all this in the context of things like African print and these other things that we may see that, I don't know what to make of it, because to me, it sounds maybe the negativity of that is overblown, because since we are doing, what is it that, I think art is always talking about this idea of what is it that you are distinctly bringing, whether it's sonically or aesthetically, right? And if it was just to have a bunch of Black people dressed in t-shirts and jeans, maybe that's what it is in actuality. But in representation, right, you might have this thing that is more hyperbolic, but it still drives home at certain points. And to me, that is not necessarily a negative thing, at least the performative aspect of it. And I'll draw this parallel now and close out with this so that I can hear sort of your thoughts on this. Is Burna Boy's new album came out, and I've really enjoyed it. But the one criticism I've gotten from many people is, it's like he picked up a lot of Americanism in his music, right? He's doing this thing, that sounds very much like he's trying to appeal to an American or an audience that is keen on American hip hop, if you will. And that seems like it's almost going the opposite way, right? That people almost prefer him when he is at least sonically doing things that are distinctly African, even though if they are part of the sort of Afropolitan community. So I don't know. I think somewhere in there's a question in as far as to discuss those that I don't, you know, I worry.
No,
that
I hear it. I hear it.
Throwing out the baby with the bathwater by saying, you know, shy away from these representations, if you will.
Well, thank you. That I actually hear you what you're saying, and what I hear is that art is subjective, and how people perceive certain things. It really comes from, and this is not saying anything like revolutionary here, right? How you perceive someone's art is really tied to your own experience. And I wager that the journalist who was troubled by the photos, which, I mean, we're all uncomfortable with photos of rundown, you know, and the stereotypical of the broken Africa, which is what everybody is familiar with. But I've also heard critique that, you know, a lot of the year of return and this high power stuff, and this is our comment earlier, that, you know, it's very much elitist in its in the way that it works out, even though there are efforts to include, you know, every day. And in fact, actually, when I was walking around, I heard people selling on the street saying, this year of return, you know, they wish they had more preparation towards it, because they feel like all of a sudden a bunch of foreign sounding people came and they wish that they had, you know, clean, you know, put more stuff in their stores and so on and so forth. So there is a careful critique to make about, as much as there is some reaching across class, I think in terms of certain spaces, it tends to gravitate towards elite representation. And so that, you know, that you can critique that on one level. As far as the question about, you know, like, for instance, Burna Boy, I heard him, there was an interview where he was talking about kind of evolving as an artist. And I think a lot of artists do this too, where, you know, and I think they're allowed to, you know, I think, and everyone is fair to critique artists as they will, but personally, I think he's allowed to change from being, you know, when he was doing a lot of Afro sounding, people said he was trying to copy Fela Kuti. So you can't do it right all the time. You take one style, they say you're copying this. You take another style, they say you're copying someone else. And it seems like African artists aren't allowed to be original or experimental. And I think what is exciting about this area is that they are being experimental and, you know, allowing themselves freedom to be whatever they want. And that's not always been afforded us. To have the freedom to today be like this person and tomorrow change it up is the privilege that I think African artists should take. You know, it's okay.
It is the bane of an artist. As a singer and a songwriter myself, I know exactly what you're.
To be put in a box, yeah.
Yeah, you're put in a box, and if you do something different, you get burned for it. You know, I remember my last album is called King Isaac's Coat of Many Colors. It's because I wanted to play the music that I grew up listening to with their variety. But there was a DJ on the radio in Zimbabwe, where I'm from, who was really bent out of shape by the fact that I wasn't singing only reggae. They had known me as a
How dare you?
Yeah, so how dare you sing a little African music? And I tried to remind him that I am an African after all. But you're right, you can never win. If you stay with it, then they say he's always playing the same music. If you do something different, oh my God, he's gone lost. He's lost his forte, you know.
Credibility, right? Yeah.
But thank you so much, and I'm going to leave it to Dr. Sarr.
Thank you so much, Dr. Avle. We really appreciate your coming today and sharing your research with us. And thank you, Dr. Colombo. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This was our last Eye on Africa for the semester. So what a beautiful way to close the series. So really, thank you all. Our thanks to you. And thank you, everybody. Please join us next semester, and more precisely, January 21st. That's the next Eye on Africa.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you.
Thank you, Dr. Avle.
Bye.
Bye.